And they've been able to take in so many nutrients out of the water column that they've had huge impacts on how our aquatic ecosystems function, specifically the food web. And then last, that picture on the right, it's an invasive species that we don't have here in New York, thankfully, although climate change might have something to say about that. That is Kudzu. Kudzu is an invasive vine, originally from Japan, that is a huge problem down south. And you can see in this picture, pretty much everything. Like all the trees, all the ground is covered in this vine. You can imagine that if you are hiking in this forest, or if there are any plants or animals that are living in this forest, you're not having a great time. So all of these are different invasive species. And you might have noticed, I'm talking about a plant, I'm talking about an insect, and I'm talking about a mussel. We're talking about organisms that are not even kind of closely related to each other, that are on very different branches of the tree of life. So what is it about these three organisms that are all very different that make them invasive? Well, invasive species can be a really nebulous sort of concept. There's a lot of different ways you could define an invasive species, but a really sort of straightforward way you could do that is just thinking of an invasive species as any organism that is non-native to an ecosystem and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause environmental or economic harm or harm to human health. And generally, there are a set of characteristics that even though we're talking about very different species, most invasive species share. So most invasive species have a very high reproductive rate. So we're talking about species that can pump out eggs or seeds very quickly. If you've ever watched like a David Attenborough documentary and he's talking about some cactus that blooms every 10 years, that is not an invasive species. Invasive species like to get it going quick. Invasive species are very aggressive, so they just grow very fast, they can take over an area very quickly. Invasive species often have no natural predators when they're introduced to a new ecosystem. And we like to sort of think of this as the potato chip effect. Often, it turns out, invasive species have very low nutritional value. So most of the native predators in that ecosystem will avoid invasive species for the more nutritious native species. And finally, I think this last point is really, really important because invasive species are not invading our ecosystems in a vacuum. They are invading a world that humans are actively changing. And as we continue to build more roads, and highways, and towns, and homes, and cities, it turns out that these environments that are being disturbed by humans, these new ecosystems we create, are really, really well-suited as a home for invasive species. So we often see invasive species doing really well in human-dominated landscapes. And you might be thinking, well, how does this even happen? How does a vine all the way from Japan get here to the US? Well, there's a lot of different pathways invasive species can spread around the world. And invasive species throughout history can be introduced either intentionally, so on purpose, or by accident. Some of the pathways include things like international trade, the pet trade, landscaping plants, and just hitchhiking on different vehicles we use. But generally, for sort of our purposes here, in the eastern half of North America, in the eastern United States, when we see invasive species coming here, we're generally seeing them coming from two places. We're either seeing them come from Europe or Eastern Asia. There's two reasons for that. For one, these are the two regions of the world that are the most similar to ours. They're the most similar climatically. These are parts of the world that have oak trees and maple trees and 4 seasons with a hot summer and a cold winter. And on the other hand, these are the two parts of the world that just by coincidence we in the United States are the most connected with, right? These are the two parts of the world where we have the most trade, where we have the most tourism. So as humans are moving back and forth, we're also seeing a lot of movement with invasive species coming along for the ride. And once invasive species enter a new region, the costs that they can have are really widespread. So we're talking about economic costs. We're talking about impacts on agriculture. We're talking about impacts on forestry, on tourism, and even utilities. Environmental costs as well. So we're talking about impacts on biodiversity, on structural diversity, on ecosystem functions and services, and even impacts on human health. So with invasive species, we can see a decrease in water quality, we can see an increase in flooding, and in some cases even injury and disease. And those costs, they're not just abstract concepts. We can put numbers on them. Invasive species have directly contributed to hundreds of species extinctions worldwide, particularly on islands, so in places like Hawaii and New Zealand, for example, and the decline of thousands more. And in the United States, we collectively spend $120 billion, I'm gonna repeat that, we spend $120 billion annually controlling invasive species. So this isn't just a huge impact on the environment, it's a huge impact on our wallets as well, and it's something that management of sucks a lot of tax dollars every year. But often, when it comes to invasive species, one of the biggest problems that we have is that we can't find them, believe it or not. Invasive species have a really good way of spreading quickly without people knowing. And there's a really good way we can sort of generalize how an invasive species comes to a new ecosystem. That's what's called the invasion curve. So the invasion curve, this is a generalization of how an invasive species takes over an area over time. And so if you look at the bottom on the x-axis from left to right, we are increasing in time. And if you look on the y-axis, so from the bottom going to the top, as we go along in our graph, as time goes on, an invasive species that is introduced to an area is going to increase the area that it infests, and the costs of removing that invasive species go up as well. And so when it comes to invasive species, we want to find them when they're first introduced, because the area that they inhabit is going to be small, and the cost of getting rid of them is going to be pretty cheap. The problem is that the public usually doesn't know about invasive species until the costs of removing them are astronomically large, because the area they've infested is equally as large. And so that's why we have education and outreach events like this. That's why I'm here, because the goal is that if we can get more people who know about invasive species, we can stop finding them on the right side of the graph, and we can start finding them on the left side of the graph. Does that make sense? So I want to sort of get into the weeds a little bit more about invasive species, and I'm going to talk to you guys about two invasive species specifically. Both are at opposite ends of this curve. So we have one invasive species, the Gypsy Moth, which has been here for at least 150 years or so. It covers most of the eastern United States, and we're just sort of stuck with it. And we have a different invasive species called spotted lanternfly, another invasive insect, and that is a new invasive species that has only arrived in North America very recently, and it's something that's very high on our radar right now. But to start off, we're going to talk about Gypsy Moth. So, earlier this spring and in the summer, did anyone here hear of or have to see or have to deal with Gypsy Moth at all while you were hiking or on your property? Yeah, so you probably saw a lot of scenes like this. There's sort of a cluster of Gypsy Moth caterpillars on the bark of that tree over there. And Gypsy Moths really are one of the worst invasive species that we have, and we were in the middle of really a historic outbreak this year. We haven't seen an outbreak like this in quite some time, probably since the 80s at the least. So let's get to know Gypsy Moth a little bit more. So scientific name, Lymotria dispar. And I would just like to make everyone aware, we as I mean sort of in the invasive species world, the name for Gypsy Moth is changing, because Gypsy Moth is seen as an ethnic slur to the Roma people over in Europe. So people are beginning to call it the LDD moth because of its scientific name. So I'm going to be, for the sake of simplicity and clarity, I'm just going to be switching back and forth between calling it Gypsy Moth and LDD moth. But just so you guys know, you might be hearing it more as LDD moth in the future as opposed to Gypsy moth. It's originally native to Europe, and it can feed on over 300 different species of plants. So this is an insect that likes to eat a lot of different things. And it's a defoliator, so what that means is that it's eating the leaves of the trees that it's on. Gypsy moth has the typical butterfly moth life cycle. Its lay starts out in eggs, eventually you have the caterpillars, they become cocoons, and they grow into fully fledged adults. Pretty standard. But really, when it comes to Gypsy moth, it's the caterpillar stage that is the most concerning. That's because the caterpillar stage is when Gypsy Moth is eating the most. And there's, like I just said before, over 300 different species of plants that Gypsy Moth feeds on, but just like us, Gypsy Moth can be a little picky. It doesn't go after every plant species out there. It likes some plants more than others. So for the biggest species of concern when it comes to what LDD moth can eat, really it's oaks, it's aspens, and poplars. If you have any of these trees on your property, or if you like to go hiking in any forests that have these trees, odds are you're probably going to be seeing a lot of LDD or Gypsy Moth. Occasionally, you'll see Gypsy Moth feeding on things like maples and walnuts and hemlocks and firs. It doesn't prefer to go after these trees, but it can eat them. And for the most part, you very rarely or never at all see LDD moth feeding on things like ash trees or dogwoods or tulip trees or Scots pine. And for the most part, LDD moth is going after woody plants. So if you notice here, all these plants are trees, right? It's not going after herbaceous plants. So it doesn't really go after things in your garden at all. But the good thing is that most of these trees on this list are pretty okay with being defoliated. Now, if you have a healthy tree that its leaves been completely defoliated, odds are it'll survive. It actually is likely to have enough energy in its root system that it can flush out new leaves. I mean, when you think about it, trees are designed to lose their leaves every year. Right? You can just go right outside it. You can see it happening right now. So for the most part, healthy trees can actually survive LDD moth defoliations. It's really only when we see unhealthy trees, or trees that are stressed because of lack of nutrients or water, where we see tree mortality, or if we see LDD moth feeding on trees that are not designed to lose their leaves. And if you were maybe a sharp observer, you noticed that I put pine and spruce in the species of concern. And so even though Gypsy Moth doesn't typically feed on those trees, pines and spruces, well, they don't lose their needles over the winter. So if you ever do see Gypsy Moth feeding on those trees, if they lose all their needles, it's pretty much game over, because they don't have that extensive sort of energy storage in their roots to reflush those needles if they lose them. And so typically, when we're talking about species of concern with Gypsy Moth, we're talking about our oaks, but also our pines and our spruces as well. And so the Gypsy Moth life cycle, it's kind of surprising when you think about it, but it's actually not active for very much long at all. Gypsy Moth will begin as an egg, like all insects do, and its egg stage will start from when the eggs are initially laid, from about mid-summer to sometime in the fall, and for 8 or 9 months, so for the majority of its life, it's just in an egg stage. If you've ever seen the sort of fuzzy, like orange, tannish sort of patches on tree bark while you're hiking, those are Gypsy Moth egg masses. Those egg masses are designed to go over the winter, so they could survive the freezing temperatures of the winter just fine, and eventually those egg masses are going to hatch April, May sort of time, sort of early to mid-spring. Once those eggs hatch, it's really that 40-day period, that month-plus stretch when the caterpillars are out, where we see the damage. Because the thing is, the only time in Gypsy Moth's life when it eats is when it's a caterpillar. It doesn't feed at all when it's an adult. So it's in the springtime where we see the biggest impacts of defoliation. And in fact, if you are ever worried about LDD moth feeding on your trees, and you might see those little webs of caterpillars on maybe a walnut tree in the fall, those are actually native caterpillars that our trees are very well adapted to. It's the springtime defoliations that are usually from Gypsy Moth. Gypsy Moth will be in this sort of caterpillar stage, defoliating trees, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, the middle point of their life in July, they will spend about 2 weeks in a cocoon, and they will emerge as fully fledged adults. The adults do not eat. They exist solely to mate, and they just run off with all the energy that they had when they were in their caterpillar stage. The females, believe it or not, even though they have wings, they can't fly. They will just wait on the trees for the males to fly on up to them. They'll mate. The females will lay their eggs. After a week, that's it. They kick the bucket. And then once those eggs are laid, the cycle will start over again. And Gypsy Moth is successful because it checks a lot of the boxes for what we talked about at the very beginning, for what makes invasive species in general successful. So Gypsy Moths have a really high reproductive rate. If you look in that middle picture at the bottom there, that is an egg mass that someone's holding in their hand, and each one of those little dots is a individual egg. So one female can lay 60 to 80 eggs. You can imagine you can get a lot of caterpillars really, really quickly. Gypsy moths have very few natural predators. Those big hairs that are on the caterpillars are actually somewhat toxic, so most of our native birds and mammals will avoid them. Gypsy moths are really good too at taking advantage of disturbance. So they're really good at taking advantage of sort of human-made habitats. They're just fine being in your lawn. They don't need some sort of intact forest ecosystem. And they're really good at taking advantage of human dispersal. So if you look at this picture in the bottom left here, all those little orange splotches on that tire, those are gypsy moth eggs. And so that's one of the ways gypsy moth can get around. And gypsy moths can pretty much pop up anywhere because it never goes hungry. Like we said, it feeds on over 300 different species of plants. Gypsy moth can pop up anywhere in the country, or at least the eastern half of the country, and it's going to find food to eat. Right now with Gypsy Moth has been here since 1869. That's when it was first introduced, way back in 1869. We're never going to get rid of it. It's here to stay. We've tried battling this bug for well over a century, and we've had mixed results at best. So for now, because this is an invasive species that's sort of at the end of that curve, most of our focus now is on containing Gypsy Moth from spreading to new regions as opposed to eradicating it entirely, because that's just simply impossible right now. So that program, however, at slowing the spread of Gypsy Moths has actually been really, really successful. So these two maps on the left shows the range of Gypsy Moth with control measures in place to slow the spread, and on the right shows what would have happened if we did nothing. So basically what we do is at sort of the frontier of the Gypsy moth population as it's sort of expanding southwards and westwards out of that gray zone, what we do is that different invasive species managers around the country will put up different traps. They will trap Gypsy moths as they're moving into a new location, and they'll eliminate them, those sort of nascent populations, before they have a chance to build up. And it's been really, really successful so far. If you look at each of those lines, each one of those lines represents the estimated range of LDD moth at a given year, and we've pretty much slowed LDD moth spread to a crawl. It has been an amazingly successful program that really doesn't cost a lot of money at all. And you can see on the right, if we didn't do anything, LDD moth would pretty much cover the entire eastern United States within a generation. So this is a really successful program for an invasive species that has been here for a long time. It's taken a lot of work. It's taken decades and decades and decades of work to get to this point, but for the most part, we're pretty, I don't want to use the word content, but we're pretty comfortable with where we're at with Gypsy Moth. This guy is someone we are not very content with. Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, so this is spotted lanternfly. This is the new sort of bad boy on the block. It is public enemy #1 in the invasive species world right now. And this insect has the potential to be at least as bad as LDD moth, potentially even worse. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But most importantly, the threat of spotted lanternfly, if it was able to spread to an area like we just saw with Gypsy moth, is huge. So long-term management, that's using pesticides, prevention measures, and different education sort of outreach, is estimated to cost the billions each year. And directly in New York State, spotted lanternfly spread throughout the state completely, it would threaten $6 billion in economic activity in New York, specifically and most importantly in the grape and the apple industries. Those are two of spotted lanternfly's favorite plants to feed on: grapes and apples. And you think about the Finger Lakes, that's a huge part of our agriculture. There's other risks as well, more minor, to the maple syrup, the ornamental plant, the forestry industries. And I just want to zoom in on that picture in the bottom right. Spotted lanternfly loves grapes. I mean, it loves grapevines. And so, in Pennsylvania, where spotted lanternfly has been found, and where this photo was taken, it is not uncommon to see vineyards where spotted lanternflies are just swarming entire vines. It's a huge problem down there. And it's a national security threat as well. So regardless of your politics, this is a picture of Joe Biden when he was running for president last year. He was giving a speech in Philadelphia, and a spotted lanternfly landed on his shoulder. So spotted lanternfly is all over Pennsylvania right now, and it's not uncommon to see those guys flying around. So let's get to know spotted lanternfly a little bit more, if it is such an important insect. So spotted lanternfly, scientific name, Lycorma delicatula, and it's originally native to China. So right, just like how I was showing before with that map of the world, we have Gypsy Moth, which is from Europe, we have spotted lanternfly, which is from Asia, right? These are where we're seeing invasive species coming in from. I'd like to see something from Australia survive a New York State winter. Spotted lanternfly is new. It was first detected in Philadelphia in 2014. And maybe the first thing you're going to notice if you look at these pictures of spotted lanternfly, each one of these pictures represents a different stage in its life cycle. It's a really cool looking bug, right? Like it's colorful, it's vivid. This is something you notice. It's black with white spots, it's got red stripes, it's this, you know, beautiful pink wings with black spots. This is cool. And the good thing is, there's really no lookalikes. There is nothing you will ever see when you're out on the trail that looks anything even remotely like these things. And spotted lanternfly is a really big insect, so they're really, really hard to miss. The adults, which is the picture with the wings in the bottom left over there, they can reach about an inch long, sometimes even more than an inch long. So we are talking about a very, very big bug here. Spotted lanternfly feeds on 70 different plant species, so it's not as many as the 300 that LDD moth is feeding on, but it's still a lot. For the most part, when we're talking about what spotted lanternfly is attacking, we're talking about tree of heaven, which is another invasive species, originally from China as well. But grapes are really the big one. Spotted lanternfly goes after grapes pretty much as soon as it's available. Any kind of fruit tree, so specifically stone fruit, so your apples, your peaches, your plums, your cherries, all of those industries are at risk because of spotted lanternfly. Spotted lanternfly will also feed on things like hops, maples, and walnut trees as well, among other tree species. Typically, just like LDD moth, spotted lanternfly is not feeding on herbaceous plants. There have been some limited reports here and there of spotted lanternfly feeding on herbaceous stuff, but usually not enough to cause damage. So this is an agricultural pest, but it's not something that we need to worry about for corn or soybeans or anything you're going to be growing in your vegetable garden. Spotted lanternfly is not going to go after those. And the way that spotted lanternfly feeds is really interesting because unlike Gypsy Moth, it's not a defoliator. In fact, it can't bite, it can't chew, it doesn't have teeth at all. Spotted lanternfly is a piercing, sucking insect. So if you look at this little diagram here in the red circle, that is what spotted lanternfly's mouth looks like. And basically, its mouth is a straw. What it does is it'll pierce its mouth through the bark of a plant, and it'll suck the sap right out. And that's how it feeds. So it's sucking sap as opposed to feeding on leaves. And it's really important to know how that feeding fits into spotted lanternfly's lifestyle and its life cycle, because it's very different than Gypsy Moth. You see, because unlike Gypsy Moth is only feeding on plants in the springtime, right? Springtime, early summer, month plus. Spotted lanternfly feeds on plants its entire life cycle. So from the moment the eggs hatch in the spring to the moment the adults die at the first frost, spotted lanternfly is out there eating. So this is not just a seasonal pest like Gypsy Moth. But let's get to know the life cycle a little bit more. So just like LDD moth, spotted lanternfly starts as an egg, and these eggs will overwinter, so they're designed to last through the cold temperatures of the winter, and they will eventually hatch in sort of mid to late spring, so a little bit later than LDD moth. And unlike sort of our moths and butterflies, spotted lanternfly is a bug. That's actually the scientific term that spotted lanternfly group that it's in. Scientifically, a bug. Bugs do not go through the big sort of metamorphosis that we see with moths and butterflies. They don't go through a cocoon. They just sort of get bigger. And so when spider lanternfly first hatches, it goes through these little stages called instars, but it's really just changing its size. When it first hatches, it's going to be black with white spots, and what this sort of graphic doesn't really show you is that when it first hatches, they are small. So this is a picture of a spider lanternfly nymph that is being bitten by an ant. So we're talking about like small ant size when they first hatch. They will feed throughout the spring, into the summer, and eventually they'll get to their fourth instar stage. That's a crucial one, because at this point, they will be black with white spots, but you'll get those big red stripes down their back. This is about midsummer, and they will be very close to their adult size. So they're going to be just shy of being an inch long. Eventually, late summer, those fourth instars with the red stripes are going to molt into a fully fledged adult. And adult spider lanternflies are really where the concern is. Because now, they have wings when they become adults. Just like all insects, they get their wings when they reach adulthood. Spider lanternfly has these big, pink, beautiful pink wings with black spots, and this is really when they're most active. This is when they're feeding the most. So it's that late summer and definitely into fall. Spider lanternflies, when they are out during this time, they're very active. They're feeding on lots of different trees because they need a lot of food, because they need to find a mate, and then they actually need to lay eggs. So this is the time, especially in September and October, spotted lanternflies are going to be laying their eggs. And that is really the concerning part of their life cycle. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But eventually, once the adults mate, September, October, females will lay their eggs, and the first frost, they will eventually die. So they only live for one year of their life. And those eggs are super, super important. You can see in the top right, that sort of gray, putty-like structure, that is a spotted lanternfly egg mass. And all of those little sort of beads on that tree, those would be individual eggs. So just like gypsy moth, spotted lanternfly is going to lay its eggs in a big mass that could have 60, 70, 80 eggs in it. And typically, in the wild, spotted lanternfly lays its eggs on things you would expect. They lay their eggs on trees, they lay their eggs on rocks, but they'll lay their eggs on a lot of things. They'll lay their eggs on bricks, they'll lay their eggs on metal, they'll lay their eggs on your car, they'll lay them on your bumper, they'll lay them in your wheel bearings, they'll lay them in your exhaust pipe. They will lay them anywhere. And it's because of that feature, because they're really just okay laying their eggs pretty much anywhere, is why spotted lanternfly has been able to spread so far so fast. So I gave a presentation last week on spotted lanternfly, and they've already found it in new locations since a week ago. This map is getting updated constantly, and so all of these blue areas are counties where spotted lanternfly has been found. So spotted lanternfly originally detected in Philadelphia. So if you think sort of the bottom right of Pennsylvania and New Jersey was sort of the heart of its range, but if you look at this map, it is spread to a lot of different areas. It's popped up all the way in Massachusetts, it's popped up in Cleveland in Ohio, it's popped up in that little county right over there in the bottom right corner of Indiana. And here in New York, it's popped up in New York City, it's popping up in the lower Hudson Valley, and it has just popped up in Ithaca, specifically in the Fall Creek neighborhood, although they've also found it downtown as well. And they just found a huge population only a few weeks ago, right outside of Binghamton, right in front of a truck stop. Gee, I wonder how it got there. This is really why spotted lanternfly is such a concern, because it is spreading very, very fast. Gypsy moth was originally introduced to the United States in 1869. And in Massachusetts, a little outside the Boston area. And it took gypsy moth 100 years to go from Boston to the Hudson River. Spotted lanternfly has made it from Philadelphia to 10 other states in 7 years. This is something that's spreading very fast, very quickly. And it's really something that we're barely trying to keep up with right now. And this is exactly what I'm sort of talking about with they'll lay their eggs on anything. So on the right, that is a camping chair. And you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 egg masses on that camping chair. So if you are camping in any of these blue areas, make sure you are checking your equipment, especially now in the fall. This is when they're laying their eggs. And you can see in this car here, all those little dots, those are all spotted lanternfly nymphs. And there's gotta be hundreds and hundreds on that wheel. So it's super, super important that if you want to help prevent the spread of this insect, if you are going to camping, spending any amount of time in any of these blue areas, please, 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 please check your car before you leave in the fall. It's so important. If you think you found spotted lanternfly in an area where it hasn't found before, we're asking you to report it. It's really just as simple as taking a picture and then emailing that picture and the location where you found it to spottedlanternfly@agriculture.newyork.gov. And I brought a bunch of giveaways over here on the side table. If you're interested in learning more about spotted lanternfly and how to report it, all that information can be found there as well. And you might be thinking, does this even work? Well, actually, yeah, it does. I work in an office of 10 people, and like I mentioned at the very beginning, we cover 17 counties. There is not enough of us to go around and sweep every conceivable place for spotted lanternfly. Your sort of scouting abilities does matter. Spotted lanternfly, of the 3 populations that have been found in New York State, so that's 1 population in New York City, 1 population in the lower Hudson Valley, and 1 population sort of Ithaca-Binghamton area, 2 of those populations were just found by normal people, just normal everyday people who just so happened to know what they were looking for and reported it. So if you think you see anything that looks like that, in the bottom left, you report it, and you could literally save us years of work. Because again, you might be finding a spotted lanternfly population that is at the very beginning of that invasive species curve, where it's really easy to get rid of them before they get out of control. If you're interested in learning more about invasive species or volunteering with us, you can help us out. We have lots of different volunteer programs going through all throughout the year. We have a volunteer trail survey, we have a macrophyte survey if you live on the water, as well as a starry snowboard survey. We are going to be launching a hemlock woolly adelgid survey this winter, so if you are a winter hiker, we'd love to have you. We're looking at doing a Tree of Heaven workshop as well. We have lots of different volunteer opportunities, so if Adirondack Club isn't doing enough to keep you outside, we can fill in the gaps. And I just want to leave us off here where, you know, we have lost the battle on a lot of different invasive species. In fact, we've lost the battle on so many invasive species that we begin to think that they're native. So all those little white butterflies that you see in your yard, they're invasive. Earthworms in your lawn, they are all invasive. Invasive species are a really huge issue, and getting all of your help, it's great to have you on the Adirondack Mountain Club, have me speak tonight. I really appreciate it, and it's great to have more people on the lookout for invasive species, because like you can actually make a difference. You can actually really help us out. And these are just some more invasive species that we have really lost the battle to. So what we're trying to do is make sure that new invasive species like spotted lanternfly, hopefully with your help, does not become the next Emil-Ash spore. That's all I got. Thank you all so much. If you have any questions, I'll take them. And I got my email in the bottom left there if you want to talk to me more about invasive species. Thank you all.
Say we find any stage of the spotted lanternfly, what do we do with it?
Like with the bug itself? Just kill it, just squish it. You squish it with your foot. You can trap it in a little jar, but we ask that after you take that picture, you squish it. Yeah. Yeah, you can, there's a lot of different ways. If you like look up online how people kill spotted lanternfly, there's people who get like BB guns and like flamethrowers. It's crazy. I originally had a video, I had to cut it out for time, of like people like shooting spotted lanternflies with their BB guns and they light them on fire. You don't have to go crazy. Dish soap. Just spray them with dish soap. If you don't want to squish them, that'll kill them too. Yeah, so if you see the eggs, what we ask you to do is You scrape them off. You can use like a credit card, and we actually have specific scraper cards to give away. Scrape them off, put them in a little bag, and then just throw them out in the trash. But if you do see the eggs, if you think you do, we want you to report that as well. Yeah. Yeah.
What about Gypsy Moth egg cases on trees? If they're not orange, they're already hatched. Because I know you're supposed to scrape those off too.
Yeah, so you want to scrape those off. Actually, now is the time. If you see gypsy moth egg masses on any trees in your yard or on the trail, scraping them off now is going to be the time you're going to want to do that because you want to do it before they hatch. There should be fresh gypsy moth egg masses pretty much anywhere. So just doing it any time before they hatch, you're going to be making an impact. So the color will just change a bit, but the white and the orange is just kind of a random color difference. They're all gypsy moths. It doesn't say anything about their vitality at all. Yeah. So you can scrape them off. If you just leave them on the ground, there is still a chance that they can hatch and survive. It's kind of a coin flip as to whether they'll do that. What you could do is, if you're hiking and you have like a little plastic bag, throw them in there, throw them in the trash when you get home, and that'll take care of them.
We saw a tree of heaven in Black Park, which is a local park. A lot of it.
Yeah, so Tree of Heaven is everywhere. I usually talk about Tree of Heaven more when I talk about spotted lanternfly. It is spotted lanternfly's preferred host plant back in Asia, and it's an invasive species that has been in the United States since 1784. It's not really an ecological problem. It's actually very low on our radar of invasive species because you usually only see Tree of Heaven growing in very disturbed areas. So like I live on South Clinton Ave, just like a few blocks away. I see it in parking lots, I see it on the sides of roads. You will occasionally see it in parks. It's rare you ever find Tree of Heaven growing in like the woods. It really doesn't like intact, healthy ecosystems. If you see Tree of Heaven, there's really no way to get rid of it. It's really, really hard to get rid of. But it is a good place to look for spotted lanternfly egg masses because that's where they're going to go to lay their eggs if it is available. So it's a good place to check out if you're looking for spotted lanternfly.
Your sign-up list, is this to do woolly adults?
Yeah, I ran out of printer ink, so I just had to sort of do a little makeshift sign-up sheet. But if you are interested in volunteering with us for our trail survey or any hemlock woolly adult stuff we're going to be doing this winter, I have a little sign-up sheet over here that you can fill out with information. You can get in touch with you about that. Any other questions? Yes, no, maybe so? Cool. All right. Well, I don't want to keep you guys waiting any longer. Thank you again, and yeah, have a good day.